I really got a lot out of this View of Nowhere book from Thomas Nagel. We talked about that last week. Can you see that better?
Yes.
Okay, so this is like what we talked about last week, where
It
I have,
appears upside down.
thank you, you can see it. So that S1 represents the self, and these subjective selves are observing objects in the world. And what Nagel is saying is to be truly objective, you have to step back from your subjective self and observe yourself observing the world. And you have to think, was I tired? Was I fatigued? Was I happy? Was I sad? And then to really be objective, you have to step back from yourself, observing the world, and think, what state was I in here? And the whole point he's making is you can't get there from here because no matter where you go, there you are, and you're always going to have your perspective with you, which keeps us perpetually subjective. My only exception I can think of to that is if God is giving you like direct revelation that is not coming through your own perspective. It's coming from an outside source. But even then, it's going to be like a little flash of lightning in the darkness. It's not like all knowledge in the cosmos has been illumined to you. You've probably got some little insight on one particular something or other. And this is not Nagel, but being a believer, when I was in that class listening to these lectures, I was thinking, oh my God. And this is what I drew in this response. Like God, in the same sense, is looking at all these objects in the world. The difference that God has from us is that God not only sees these objects externally, but God sees all these things from the inside out. And so not only is God looking at trees, people, rabbits, rodents, flowers, but God knows what it's like to be that mighty tree growing in the forest, to be that human that just lost their job, to be that rabbit who's running from a coyote, to be that flower growing in the meadow for just a few days. And so, because God, and this is how I would define absolute or objective truth, it's having all perspective all the time. But that's not something that's an option for us. And that's okay.
So I'm thinking, I have one question. Um, so we as therapists would not really have the highest degree of empathy because we are too subjective. Each day is different. We get into a traffic, we don't sleep that well, or so that subjectivism prevents us from showing empathy, and really the patient or the client can really heal themselves better than we can do it. We're just mechanism that can help them get there, which is an obvious fact. But I wondered, what your intake on empathy is. Being us being subjective,
I wish
towards.
I knew how to teach it. I think we can learn empathy. Unfortunately, when I think of my own life and how I learned it, it was through suffering. The more I suffered, the more I could be empathetic with other people. It's hard to be empathetic when you've never had pain or loss because you just don't understand. And I'm not saying I understand their pain or loss, but I do understand pain and loss. And because of that, I can enter into those spaces that before I suffered profoundly, I wouldn't have even known how to behave or what to do or what to say or to realize there's nothing to say. Sometimes you have to just sit with people in silence because any word is going to be raw and not helpful. And what you were saying was making me think of something else and I lost it. Say that last thing you said. Oh, it had to do with I'm also really interested in critical thinking as a philosopher. And as you were talking about, we can't always be so empathetic as counselors or therapists because of our own messed upness, or we had a hurried morning, or we got rattled, or we have something gnawing at the back of our mind and we're not able to give our full attention to that person. And I think that kind of self-awareness is invaluable. And I would, well, I'm speaking as a philosopher, but I would tell people, I would say, I'm having a rough morning. Um, I don't need to go into a lot of detail or something, but I'll just say, I really want to be with you here, and it's important. It's just I do have a few little distractions going on. So if you see me not giving you my full attentions or something, just call me on it and bring me back because I want to be here for you. And I like that kind of honesty and transparency, and that we're not just this infallible fountain of truth, but we too are subjective humans and subject to the foibles of life. And as a critical thinker, the first thing I teach people is we have to become aware of our own perspective. We need to know where our limitations are, where we're flawed, where we're not able to see things clearly, how maybe my gender gives me certain biases, maybe being an American has given me different biases. Maybe being brought up fundamentalist Christian has given me another set of biases. And so being a man gives me a different set of biases. And so I have to be aware of my own perspectival biases to be clear. Now, I personally don't believe I can be truly objective, but I don't see it as an either or. You're either subjective or objective. I believe we have powerful tools where we can move towards objectivity. And part of that, in a mini way, is acquiring different perspectives. God has all perspectives, but we can get a lot. Not like what God has, but oh my God. And the more you counsel, the more you're with different types of people, you're going to get more and more perspectives be able to use to help that particular individual. Even though they're different from all those other people, the more you're exposed and the more you learn different perspectives, it will aid in your counseling of that individual.
Thank you. Ironically, it's very freeing to know that there are certain limits to where we can go, and realizing our biases and our culture and our everything else is very enlightening. Thank you.
Yes. R.D. Lang, I mentioned that briefly. That was the study in multiple personality disorder. I got a lot out of that book simply because this wasn't my field. And we also got to watch a lot of videos and experiments on like split brain experiments and how like the connection between the hemispheres in some people for different conditions had been removed or severed, and how it affected the people's functions. Um, that would kind of be fun for me next week to kind of pursue some of that, some of the split brain experiments, some of like, and then thought experiments that go with it. Like, what if you left one hemisphere in a body and put the other hemisphere in another body? Would you have two different people? Or is that one person in two locations? And those sorts of weird thought experiments. But I love that kind of stuff. And similar to R.D. Lang's book, The Divided Self, but in a more novel way, is Hermann Hesse, or Hesse, and his book Steppenwolf. Is anyone familiar with that? Did anyone ever read that book? Most people know his book Siddhartha. It's kind of the story of a young Brahmin trying to seek enlightenment, but being told by a Western author, and I found it really helpful. Well,
Sorry, did you just say Siddhartha?
yes,
Oh, I've read that.
that's the same author. Yeah. But this book he wrote after he had done therapy with Carl Jung. And that I think is super fascinating. And so this book, Steppenwolf, and I know we're almost out of time, so I'm going to end on this note. Hermann Hesse is one of my favorite authors. He's an existential author. He wrote between the world wars. He was German. He actually fled Nazi Germany when the Nazis came to power, went to Switzerland because he was not going to, well, he would have been executed because he was a free thinker and all of that. He would have been right after the gypsies and homosexuals. They went after the intellectuals and then the Jews. And so he fled the country. But in this book, it's about Harry Haller. And Harry Haller is like this bourgeoisie businessman. He's relatively well off. He moves in polite circles. He knows how to live in society, how to be proper behaved. But there's another part of Harry Haller, and that is inside of him is the Steppenwolf, or a wolf of like the steppes of Asia. And this being in him is wild, ravenous, lustful, violent, does not like domestication, wants to rend and tear. And this poor man is trying to navigate life as this polite bourgeoisie Harry Haller with this wolf living inside of him is like another part of his personality. And so say he goes to a party and the people are being vapid and gross and really surfacey, but he's being polite because he's a bourgeoisie man and he's not going to call them on their silliness. But when he gets home, the wolf will call him on not calling people out on being fakes and frauds. But then if his wolf comes out and he lashes and tears and ridicules people, Harry will beat the wolf when they get home and say, you can't act like that. You can't just let out your feelings and your rage and your thought. We have to control it. And so he's in this horrible torment. And towards, once again, spoiler alert, but I don't think it will take away from the reading. He enters this place called the Magic Theater. And as he's walking down, there's countless doors. And behind each door is another part of who he is. He's not just the bourgeoisie businessman and a wolf. There's a child, there's a soldier, there's an artist, there's a musician, there's all these different aspects of his being. And I think this is how Carl Jung helped him. He helped him realize that we are made up of a multiplicity of personalities. We're not just one person or self. And when you think about all the different voices you hear in your head, most of us have an overarching voice that can keep the other voices in check. But often people with like multiple personality disorder, they do not have that like overarching narrator or editor to say which voice gets to speak. And so if you can imagine living with all the voices we all have inside of us, but not being able to control which one gets to speak when. And oh my God, I fell in love with that book. And every single person I've ever met that's read it felt just like Harry Haller. When I was reading the book, I was like, how does Hermann Hesse know me so well? I have the same wolf inside me. And apparently so does everybody else, because I've never met anyone who read that book and said, what was that all about? They were just like, oh my God, it was like looking into my soul. And I think that really helped him and helped him learn not to be afraid of these different voices, but to start realizing like, oh, that was my dad, or that was a teacher I had back in high school, or that's something I heard on the radio, or that's coming from my mama or a friend. And some voices are my own, but many of them aren't. But at least at this state, I have a Fred that is able to say who gets to speak when, at least most of the time. Not always, but most of the time. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me for another night.